The Sound Off Podcast. The podcast about broadcast with Matt Kundle. Starts now.
This week I speak with Amanda Cupido, who is the new Director of Talk and Talent at AM 640 in Toronto. Previous to this, she started a company called Lead Podcasting that built awesome podcasts. She's taught journalism at Ryerson, Seneca, worked in communications and in social media, in newsrooms like News Talk 1010 and AM 640. And in short, Amanda is a storyteller who knows how to tell a story on multiple platforms. This is radio talent for the 2020s. You know, I started this podcast to find the intersection between podcast and broadcast. So I'm thinking today we might have the perfect guest. Amanda is one of the rare agnostics when it comes to podcast and broadcast. It is going to be interesting to get her take. Amanda joins me from Toronto. Why did you ever want to become a journalist?
I always loved storytelling. I think a lot of people will say that. Maybe sounds cliche. But when I was in high school and we had to start deciding on what programs to apply for, I just took a look at everything I loved that I was doing in school. And that included the morning announcements. That was writing for the school newspaper. That was being on my student council and drama class, improv team. And so the crossover there was storytelling, journalism, being around people, speaking to audiences. It all connected. And so then when I found out about Ryerson's journalism program, I just thought that's where I got to go.
So I was listening to another podcast, a broadcast dialogue, where they were speaking with Carol Off, who is leaving the CBC shortly. And one of the things she said in the podcast was, I wanted to do it the same way Barbara Frum would do it. So when you look back at the people you saw in journalism when you were coming up with these decisions, who do you look to?
It's funny. I wasn't the kid who watched the 6 o'clock news and thought, seeing an anchor on there and thought, oh, I'm going to be that. I listened to a lot of radio, though. I fell in love with a lot of radio hosts, especially on the FM side. There was a couple people I'll shout out to. Tarzan Dan, who I called in and did a high school career report on. They said, interview someone that you want to grow up to be like. And in between breaks, he kept coming back to the phone with me and answering all my questions about how to make it as an FM jock. And I sent him an email once I got into the industry later to thank him for that. And, that was there. So there was definitely people like that I really enjoyed and looked up to. I also loved community TV, which I think just goes down to my roots of being connected to audiences and being an extrovert and wanting to get involved on a community level too. And so I remember Phil Martino was the subject of my entry level essay to get into Ryerson journalism. And that was because I actually was working with her at Rogers TV at the time. And then we got to work together as journalists. She was at 680 and I was at CFRB. And there were moments where her Marantz was out of batteries and I had to give her mine. And so it's fun to cross paths with people that you looked up to like that. And I think the industry is really special. And so, yeah, there was just a slew of people. That was just a few that I then later got to work alongside, which was quite special.
Tell me a little bit about going through the Ryerson program. I know it's changed over the years, but when you were there, what'd you love about it?
Well, I really connected with some of the professors. There's many of them that I'm still friends with to this day and that we go out for coffees. And my first year reporting class with Professor Don Gibb, a shout out to him. I was part of his last class before he retired. And he really was that traditional journalist, like capital J journalist, who just taught you how to write an amazing lead, who picked apart every sentence of your assignment. And a lot of A+ students would go into his class and walk out with C's and tears. And anyway, he really changed the way I look at storytelling and really put some great foundational elements into how I craft stories. And I still give him kudos for that. And he's still doing consults and newsroom trainings to this day. But the program itself had a really high standard. I was amongst peers who were amazing and inspired me and who I'm still friends with to this day as well. At the time, they had just broken away from the format where you had to streamline. I was the first class who did not streamline into a specific medium as a response to the shifting industry and needing to be more multi-platform and multi-dimensional in what your expertise was in. But they were still trying to iron out the kinks of that. And part of what I loved about the program was that there was a lot of flexibility and creativity that I was able to bring. And I remember doing a podcast for one of my classes, and this will be, I guess it was like 2009, right before I was going to graduate. And that wasn't even an option for how you could submit, but I made one. I don't even think it was for marks. I just made it as part of my assignment. And I remember the instructors, though, really applauding me for it. I've been a podcast lover for a long time. And so I think back to those moments and just feeling at least proud that I had the flexibility and the equipment and the support to kind of, go and venture off into exploring new mediums, even at that time.
Well, how excited would a professor be to be able to grade the work while just simply downloading it from iTunes?
Yeah, that's right. Though at that time, I think I don't even know if that was on their radar. I think I had to submit the MP3 because it was just, there wasn't the format or the systems built around it just yet. But yeah, then I really got involved with the school community too. I worked at the Eye Opener at Ryerson, which I loved and really helped me hone my pitching and my editorial skills. And some really great radio professors who made me fall in love with audio. So it was there's many, many elements of it that I loved.
Well, there's many, many elements to this interview today because we're going to talk about radio. We're going to talk about podcasts. We're going to talk about journalism. We're going to talk about media. So maybe it was
wait.
Maybe it's a good thing you didn't get streamlined.
Yeah, definitely. And the program has continued to evolve into not streamlining and has built an even more cohesive approach to how they teach it. And now even incorporating elements like communications and PR. And there's ways that you could kind of branch out. When I was there, even internships, it was very much you had to be in a newsroom. And I was one of the first who deviated a little bit from that and really had to fight for it, though now they have really opened it up and encouraged students to do it where they want. But I interned with the Marilyn Dennis show in their inaugural season, which, because I loved lifestyle, I thought I was going to get into lifestyle TV at one point. And so that was where I had done my internship, but ended up landing at CFRB 1010, which I'm sure we'll get to in a bit. But anyway, and then I fell in love with talk radio.
Actually wanted to get to that right now. And what did you find when you went into the venerable CFRB and those call letters and that 1010 dial position and the newsroom?
It's funny because I went in really cold, actually. Again, a lot of people who end up working there will say that their parents listened to the station growing up. And it's my family is Italian. We came from Italy. My grandparents don't understand any English. They still don't speak English. They weren't brought up with English radio in the house. And so it's actually Italian radio stations that I grew up with. So CFRB to me, I didn't actually realize the gravitas of it. And I walked in just like, okay, this is a radio station. Let's see what they're about. And now maybe admitting this now, I probably didn't let on to that when I walked in at the beginning, but it helped because I think it took away maybe some of the allure and the nervousness that others might have felt going into a place like that. I went in just really open, and I didn't think I was going to get into talk radio. At that time, I thought I was going to probably end up on the FM side of things. And I just thought, okay, well, this is radio. It's close enough. Let's see what we can do. And after one day, I shadowed Jerry Agar for one day at that station, and I just loved everything. I loved everyone I was meeting in the halls. I went into that, popped my head into the newsroom. I loved the energy there. And I just walked away thinking, oh my gosh, this is game changing. I gotta stay part of this however I can.
What was your first podcast experience, by the way?
My very first one was while I was in school. Again, this is like 2009. And I was writing for a digital magazine, which doesn't even exist anymore. And I helped them launch a podcast. And it was called Word on the Street. And I hosted it. And it was up everywhere. And you could still find it if you look hard enough. It's quite cringy. But yeah, but I was experimenting and I got to do a lot of fun things, and I actually got a lot of media accreditation because I think people were just so allured by the idea of a podcast. So I got into award shows. I got some really big name guests. It was great. So that was while I was in school. That was my very first one that I made.
And the podcast space was so different back then. I mean, it was exciting to get into iTunes, and really iTunes was and pretty much the only place to put your podcast if you wanted to get a whole bunch of downloads.
Yeah.
I mean, today there's so much choice, but think back to then. Did you actually have to take your iPod and plug it in and download it physically? And
yeah, so the Ryerson one that I made, I think just lived on our website. Like we didn't even actually put it up and sync it to iTunes. I think it was a bit of a stretch. The one I did for that magazine was out there. It was on Podbeam, I think, or one of those early hosting sites. And I didn't even have an Apple device at the time. So I would go to it from that page and listen and share the links and listen from there.
That time when you were working at 1010 and you're working with Jerry Agar, and you're on the air, you're also doing production, you're chasing stories, and then there's a moment when, because you'd mentioned it earlier, you're like, oh, I thought I would do a little bit on FM, but you did some work on FM, and
yes,
and you went to North Bay. Was that to get more experience behind the microphone?
Yeah, and because I secretly had this idea that I was meant to be an FM radio. So I was at News Talk 1010 producing Jerry Agar, loved producing, but thought the longer I'm a producer, the less chance I have to make it on air. At the time, Kim Geddes was leading the newsroom, and she was giving me some opportunities to file what we called in-depth. They were longer, featurey kind of stories. And I really appreciated that, and I loved it. And then I thought, I have to, if I really wanted, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to fully make the shift while at 1010. And so I went to North Bay, a city that I still love and I visit every single year. And I worked as a morning show co-host alongside Mike Monahan at the Moose. And I was also leading the newsroom. So I did the news and I was a morning show co-host there. And I spent about a year there, and it was great, but I was like, oh, a 90-second break. I need a 9-minute segment to sink my teeth into this topic. I really miss talk radio.
You miss the long form 9-minute breaks and
yeah.
Stuff.
And I miss the big city. I mean, I was always a city gal. And so I pushed some buttons, people in North Bay for sure. Because I was just used to kind of digging a bit and not necessarily, I don't know. I just had my real journalistic chops out. And I think some people maybe weren't expecting that, especially because I was a bit of a friendly face. And then I knew how to turn it on when I needed to. So, but yeah, no, but I loved chasing the stories, and I missed chasing the stories at the pace of Toronto.
It's really dawning on me now how back in, I think, the late 2008-9, when Chorus went to the CRTC and asked for some FM frequencies for these AM news talk stations. And when I'm talking to you, who's in the position that you're in now, what a great loss it is for radio to have all these great news outlets just sitting on AM and having the FM dial rather devoid of news and talk, where I think the only one in the country, is 98.5 in Montreal, which is the number one powerhouse. And there might be a handful of others elsewhere, but what a lost opportunity for the CRTC to really bring talk to FM.
Everyone at AM really wants to be on the FM dial. I'll tell you that. It just comes down to, we need some regulations to change so that Chorus doesn't have to get rid of one of its FM properties in order to move us over,
I hear you. You're not obligated to comment on any of this. This is just my general bitching about the industry.
It's fair. And I think you're not alone in that.
What'd you do after Moose?
I went back to Toronto, went back to News Talk 1010, and I was working 2 jobs at the time. I was working 7 days a week, which I loved. I was working at the digital content agency doing that video production, but I loved radio and I missed talk radio. And so I went back to 1010 as a reporter and then news anchor. So I was doing shifts throughout the week, but always in the newsroom on the weekends. in some capacity. And now I was going back to News Talk 1010 as a Bell property. So it was a bit different. And we were in the Queen Street studio. And so that was an interesting evolution to witness as well.
In short, it wasn't the same.
It wasn't the same. And in some ways, it was better. And in some ways, I mean, there was a lot of cuts. And so I was, even just in the first year of me going back there, I went from being a reporter to news anchor. It was great because I was performing well, but it wasn't just a promotion. It was that we got rid of everyone and I was the last one there. And so I was news anchor because then it was only me. And I was also the web writer, the breaking news alerts person, I was everything. It was just me. And we would have 2 people in the newsroom over the weekend, and we would just kind of trade off.
How did you ever get to the Middle East, Afghanistan and Jordan? What did you see? Why were you there?
A big jump. Yeah. So after I worked at CFRB, I went to work for a digital content agency. That's where I started doing social media, a lot of video production. That was the first team that I led, a video production team, a lot of branded content. And I started stepping away from radio, which was hard for me because I loved it. But at the time, it felt like the right move. I was really intrigued by the digital space. I was making podcasts on the side. And I found this opportunity to do corporate communications with World Vision Canada, which was an incredible organization who I was already donating to. And I think for journalists who make the crossover to communications, you got to find a brand or a mission to really rally behind, because a lot of our hearts are in the same place where we want to tell important stories. And so I continued to make my podcasts on the side and went into working with both World Vision Canada and eventually World Vision International. And so being on those communications teams is how I had the opportunity to travel to a lot of places, what they would call fragile contexts. So these are dangerous countries, unstable. You actually have to have special training before they send you to the field in those areas. And so I went to a military base and I trained for, I think it was like 4 days. And it's quite the experience. They actually hire actors, sometimes 100 actors, and you'll be living on base and they emulate as if you're in one of these fragile contexts. And you'll need to, you learn how to handle being kidnapped, advice for what it's like if someone was to come on and start shooting up a room, and how does your body respond when a grenade is thrown at you. And so they were shooting blanks at us at random times. There was a moment where we were all out in a field and we were even taught how to be in a car, and how does your body react when you hear gunshots, and how do you exit a car? And anyway, there's all these simulations, and sometimes you forget it's a simulation, and that's the whole point, is to get you to react in this way. Anyway, all of this to say is that I did all of this before going to those countries. So it's not just like I hopped on a plane and plopped myself in the middle of Afghanistan. After much careful training and sending me out, I ended up getting to go. I traveled with a lot of different storytelling initiatives and programs where we were either training journalists from these countries. So one of my trips in Jordan was 10 days in a refugee camp with Syrian refugees who all wanted to be journalists. And we brought them some amazing technology and we worked with them so that they could each create their own story. It was incredible. It was in partnership with Al Jazeera, their VR team. And they all did virtual reality stories, like 360 stories, which was so special. Afghanistan, I was traveling with the CEO of World Vision Canada. And this was when Afghanistan was experiencing some horrible flooding. And it was in the midst of also looking at some of our programming, some women empowerment programming. And it was incredible. That was one of the most influential moments of my life. I got to meet some incredible women. And obviously the recent news of Afghanistan's state has really weighed on my heart. But I'm happy that I was able to actually keep in touch with some people there and try to do what I can to help them, because there is I think Afghanistan, visually is a beautiful country, and we don't really think about that as Canadians. And a lot of the stories we hear in the media and that typically make our headlines are quite dismal, and rightfully so. Like some of the things that are happening there are heart-wrenching, but there was a really wonderful side to that country and some really inspiring stories that I got to tell and bring back. And I could talk about this forever. Maybe I should stop there. But one quick example is we got to go to a mall that was launched with support from World Vision, and it was all women business owners, and women in some of these small towns are literally not allowed to leave their house without their husbands. And this was a mall with all of the stores were owned by women. And it was the one place that women could go on their own just to shop and get their hair done. And it was the energy there was incredible. And what these women got loans. And then when their businesses did well, they had paid back the loans, and it was cyclical. So it was, and that took 2 years to help get the men on board to believe that this was a good idea, and then to launch this, and then to have all these businesses launch. Walking in there and talking to those women, it was incredible.
In just a second, we go back to Canada and dive deep into the podcast talk. Sorry, can't help myself. We're going to talk about storytelling and radio and podcasting as it pertains to news. And we're going to talk about the big podcast void in Canada. There is plenty of room to grow. There's more. Oh, there's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.
The Sound Off Podcast with Matt Kundle.
And you never got away from podcasting.
I always loved podcasting. And this is why this is my time. I feel like I knew this was going to happen. I was just waiting for it. So I was always making them on the side, just through word of mouth, people who would come to me, a lot of businesses and entrepreneurs. And I was kind of always had one or two on the go. But when I was at MediaFace, which was the digital content production company, I launched a branded podcast vertical while there. It was a small startup vibe, and the founder was incredible to support me in that. And I actually sold podcasts probably. And again, that was in 2015, pretty early before the branded podcast boom that we're seeing now. When I was at News Talk 1010, I was pitching podcasts. It was a bit early, and those ideas didn't ever get I don't think it got any real consideration, unfortunately, but that was the time. Even while I was at World Vision, I was creating podcasts. I created an internal podcast for World Vision. I created a series for World Vision Canada, and I created a series for World Vision International. So I was always championing it and plugging away at it however I could.
And then you wrote a book.
And then I wrote a book, which was never my plan, but I was doing podcast workshops, and there was a publisher in the audience at one of them. And she said, "Why don't you turn this into a book?" And I just thought, why? I don't really. And I spent 2 years writing the book. So my book came out in 2018, but I actually started writing it in 2016, which just goes to show this was not, it wasn't necessarily, jumping on the bandwagon at that time. It was still a bit, especially in Canada. At this time, I was also I was trying to see what my next move should be. And I was meeting with Huffington Post and different media organizations just to get a sense of what their interest or their appetite might be in investing in podcasting. And no one was there yet. I was just told video, we're all doing video, which I'm happy to see. Actually, all of these places that I met with are now doing podcasts. So they came around. I also met with Chris Boyce from Pacific Content at that time, and we nerded out with our love for it and our vision. And I'm so glad to see them doing so well too, because I felt like he was one of the people that I was really able to bond with over the vision we had for what this industry might be in Canada.
So I thought Canada was a little bit slow. You go back to 2015, there really wasn't a large podcast presence. Get to 2017 there's a little bit more interest, and then the uptick starts to really kick in. And I'm looking at this just from the radio side of things, and how slow it was for everybody to get involved. And by everybody, sort of Curious Cast kicks in around then. Mm-hmm. Rogers kicks in with frequency. CBC, of course, has been going all along, the public radio space has. But why did it take so long for radio to get involved?
This is the Big question. I don't know. I was banging my head against the wall saying, let's even just look across the border. There's so many use cases for this. Like, I laugh because you start to feel insane a bit. I'm like, we know that Canada is always feels media-wise that we're just a couple steps behind from the US. So why don't we just start looking at what they're doing and what's successful there? And I'm not saying every single thing that's successful there will be successful here, but if there's these large trends, we saw large trends with money being made and acquisitions already starting to happen and podcast production companies popping up and people from radio moving to podcasting, all these things were happening. And I just thought, why are we like closing our eyes to this? It's right there. And one comparison I do like to make is that when the Daily launched, when New York Times started investing in the Daily, us here in Canada, we were still running around trying to make tablet versions of newspapers cool. And I love that people were trying things and risking things, but I do think we weren't opening our eyes to the media landscape broad enough. And I think also we get very insular in North America and we weren't looking across borders. Like BBC's investing in their podcast game. Australia was seeing huge upticks. Europe is actually leading in a lot of podcast spaces, which many people don't even realize. But when we look at our strategy here, we don't look beyond enough. And I think it actually limits us and what we're able to dream up and what calculated risks we're able to take.
Two of the Canadian success stories from that era, 2014, 15, 16, Pacific Content being one, and Jesse Brown with Canada Land, who has his own network and has built it himself and admits, I don't want to sell this network. I wouldn't know what to do with myself every day, but going out and making these great series and just thinking in the audio space and not worrying about the video and the tablets and some of the other nonsense.
Yeah, I think there's so much potential for audio and we're finally coming around to it. It needed some early adopters. And I still think we're quite limited though. If you think about what networks and collectives and what's really emerging out of Canada, we're still so far behind. And that's why I tell people who ask about wanting to get into podcasting, like, you're not too late. Canada needs more. And all the research shows that Canadian listeners want more Canadian podcasts. So if you do it intentionally, if you do it strategically, you actually have a great shot at succeeding. If you commit to it, right? If you really want to do this, there's a market for it.
Do you have to export the podcast? Do you have to be in the story export business in order for it to be successful? Does it have to get a US audience?
No, I don't believe that. Right now, maybe as it currently stands, if you're not part of a major network that's already pre-established, I think it might be easy to think that you can make that mark if you go global like that. But what I recommend to people is that, Nate, you also open up your competition. If you're trying to make a podcast about leadership that's great for North Americans, you're going to be up against so many other podcasts, and I don't think you'll win. But if you narrow in on Canadian, look at you, even like your niche, your podcast is garnering a listenership because it's niche and this was an unserved audience previously. And so you want to be strategic on how you're niching down. And sometimes the niche you just need is to put a Canadian lens on it. And you'd actually be surprised at how many people you still will get audiences outside. People want to know what's happening in Canada from a real Canadian perspective and leaning into that. So I do think there is something, it's not for everyone, but it is worth considering a geographical niche, whether it be a city or a country, as far as, how you target your podcast. And technology is still emerging and growing. And that's also going to come alongside and open up new doors for podcasters who have a bit of an established audience too.
So geolocal is the future and size doesn't matter.
I wouldn't say it as a sweeping statement, but I would say that there is a space there for success for sure.
If you had to update your book, what do you have to add to your book? Because
I think about this all the time.
I've always been nervous about writing a book. People say, why don't you write a book about podcasting? And I'm like, because the minute it gets published, it's outdated because the future moves so quickly now.
Partially why I wrote mine for 2 years, because I just kept updating and at some point you just had to stop because it wasn't going to so I tried to future proof it a bit. And I don't know if you have the book. I can mail you a copy if you like. But part of it is really taking an evergreen approach to some of it. I picked apart some of my favorite podcasts and why I thought they did well and what unique, approach to their production that they brought. And sometimes I had some extra insights because I had met people behind the scenes or whatever. And so that sort of case study, is I think that no matter what, that does stand the test of time. There definitely were some areas where my personal views have changed on things. I also got requests. I didn't do anything about interviewing, like the art of interviewing, which is a workshop I run, but I would love to put a chapter in on that. Again, that's like a foundational skill set to have. And it does cross over to radio, but also there are some really unique things that people need to bring to the podcast medium, which I'm sure now from doing both radio and podcasting, but a lot of people don't really realize even if they're in the radio industry. So yeah, there's a lot of ideas like that float around in my head. I also include transcripts in mine. I have like a raw tape versus an edit, which I think is really interesting for people to learn if they're wanting to get into the space. And again, that kind of holds true and is sort of the same vein that I now realize On Being does with their podcast. They put up the raw unedited episodes, and then the slickly produced version On Being with Krista Tippett gets up there. But if you're there's a little fun fact. If someone's wanting to learn the behind the scenes look at how things get done, that's a good one to check out because they put up the raw.
Yeah, I think you'd have to put in a whole chapter on video and YouTube and all the search that you get from it. I've actually recommended to one podcaster, take the raw interview that you're doing, like, we're recording right now, put that up as your video, and then create a wonderful audio pleasure off to the side.
I know, but I'm also I'm so anti-video.
I am too. Half this conversation is probably going to be edited out for all my ums and ahs and all that stuff.
But it's I think two people are different when there's video involved, So when I make them, I use audio only. I use Clean Feed to record with my podcast production company. And I really encourage people to step out of the norm of the video element, which I know it can help and you read people's mannerisms, but guests that aren't media trained, even for the hosts themselves, which a lot of times I'm coaching new hosts, to remove the video element. You can have your notes everywhere. You don't have to worry about your makeup. You're able to be more focused. And I do think YouTube and SEO is something definitely to take into account and can be part of your strategy, but it's really being intentional about what's going to be the focus and how are you going to make the best podcast. And sometimes that means no video.
I was going to ask you a little bit about the future, but I think you touched on it when you said transcription. And I know as a company, I've just bought a transcription service because we have a human rights podcast, and it only makes sense that, people who can't hear have the ability to, read along with the podcast.
Yes. I'm actually part of a really exciting initiative with Seneca College where we are going to be rolling out some classes that teach podcasting in a very different way with accessibility at the forefront. And I think it's really important. I find it shocking that some of my clients don't opt to include transcripts with their shows. I think it's like a win-win. It opens your podcast up to more audiences, but then it also helps with your SEO. For me, it just makes complete sense. I also think technology is getting better, where we're seeing some automated transcription that is animated to match the cadence of the audio podcast, which is also good for pacing, but also for people who have partial hearing. You might be able to actually get some of the soundscapes and then read alongside. But technology, I alluded to this. I think technology in the podcasting space is lacking across the board. And people's talk about podcasting being a bubble. I think that's just BS, because once the technology starts to help push the medium forward, my gosh, it's going to open up so many more doors. Right now, the technology is trying to play catch up to what people are doing and the stopgap measures that we figured out on how to make things work. So there's going to be a whole other wave coming once some of these big tech players get their acts together.
You were a judge for the Ambies.
Yes, you've done your research. This is good.
And the Podcast Academy. Actually, I've been a member now for a couple of years.
It's great.
What do you think the role is for the Podcast Academy?
I think it's important. It brings people together. I think a lot of these awards, I don't know if you've noticed this, but like there's so many podcast awards, and some of them you're basically paying to get an award, and there's just, it's actually a money grab. It's sad. I mean, it's smart, I guess. It's smart business. Someone's cashing in because everyone wants to say they have an award-winning podcast. And I think the Ambies is one of the first ones that is accessible. So there's obviously the Peabody and the Webbies. Those are the big, there's some really big titles there to be won by podcasters, and that's great. But the focus wasn't podcasting, right? These were other awards that then gave a podcasting category. The Ambies is the podcast award by the best players in the industry. The board is made up of really respectable people. The members are genuinely there for podcasts, and they are all the award categories are meant to be for podcasters. And so, sometimes you'll even see some of these awards where it's like best series, but then you're only allowed to upload one episode, like silly disconnects like that. Whereas the Ambies were built for podcasters by podcasters. And I think it's nice to have a body like that really champions good work in the space and makes it, and they're making efforts to make it really accessible for people to apply to. They have an indie podcast category. These are all things that I think it's needed for the space. And it was a long time coming. So I'm glad we have it.
So you spent 10 years in podcasting. Here's an opportunity for you to tell your stories in long form, the way you want. Maybe you want to have seasons. Maybe you want to dedicate an entire podcast to telling the story. But here you are in 2021 and you're a course. So what made you apply to AM 640 to be a director there?
Yes. Well, the opportunity came to me is the honest truth. I was leading Lead Podcasting, my podcast production company, which I launched in 2020 formally when I decided to scale my work in podcasting. And I was having a ball, and I really believe in it, and it was growing and is continuing to grow. And I'm lucky that I set up a lot of strong foundational elements for that business now to be continuing, but with me just as an advisor. I've stepped back and now director of talk and talent at 640 Toronto. When the opportunity came my way, I initially said no, but then I slept on it and I thought about it, and I was so excited about the possibility. And I had a chat with the national director of talk radio, Larry Gifford, and his vision and the direction course was moving into. I mean, this is not lip service. This was the truth of how they sucked me in. They didn't suck me in, I just really believed in it. And I just thought, my gosh, this was what I was wanting. This was some of the things that I had wanted to do 10 years ago when I was at CFRB, and the timing wasn't right and I never got to do it. And so I just thought, now's the time. This was that like, what if that actually came back, which I was not expecting. And I really had to go with my gut. And I thought, let's do this. Let's actually change what talk radio and the traditional legacy media looks like in Canada. And I'm giving the space and the support to really innovate here. And that excited me. And knowing that my company was in a space where I actually could step away, but still continue as an advisor and still have it continue on, it was a no-brainer for me. I had to come and do this.
And shout out to Larry Gifford, who had the original podcast about radio, which started about 2 years before mine, maybe even 3 years.
He's also a podcast lover, which is probably why we got along. Yeah.
So I'm looking at some of the activities that have taken place in the early part of 2022. This is where we could probably insert honking horns and a whole bunch of other stuff. But when you take a look at a unfolding news story like this, it's all about the live and now. But at the same time, I'm envisioning you collecting and stacking audio for the future stories, or for the stories that are currently being written about this. Am I right?
Maybe. I think you're right. And that's one of the beauties of radio is the live and interactive element. And that's what I keep trying to remind everyone. Like, this is our superpower. Everyone keeps saying radio versus podcasting. It's like there's a lot of differences. And the fact that we are so able to flip around a story so quickly and bring people there and engage and have a caller completely change a segment, that's special. We need to lean into that when it makes sense. But I definitely think our approach to podcasting as a station has to change. I mean, this is for all radio stations. A lot of people will put up the show and cut out traffic breaks and call it a podcast, or will do an extra interview, an extended cut of an interview and put it on their podcast. And I just think it needs to be reevaluated. And I think we have to see what's working. And is that actually working? To a limited audience, yes. But is that the potential for what podcasting and connection to a radio station can do or be? Heck no. And I'm so excited to build something there that will really change what that landscape looks like for maybe all radio stations, but for AM radio stations right now, for sure.
What about the role of a daily podcast?
Yep. I mean, I think the daily is brilliant. And at the time, they were right on the money with it. For me, right now, not a priority. I think I'd rather build something great and sustainable and see if it works and then increase the frequency of it rather than trying to pump out a daily that is maybe not as good as it should be and doesn't have the resources of the daily, for instance, which is a team of like 30, probably more people now. Last time I heard it was in the 30s.
And revenue generation of $300,000 a month.
Yeah, huge. But they got there slowly, right? That didn't happen overnight. We have to remember they launched years ago. And I think a lot of people look at that and go, well, now they've done it, so we can't. And it's not to say, it's to take what's worked and from across many different podcasts and put it together to make something else that's going to work. We have so many examples of what works now. So how can we take winning elements of multiple case studies around us and build something that's going to be winning for us in our own right?
If I were to count up all the Canadian daily podcasts, I'd probably get to, 8, 10, something like that. And that's still not enough. And
they're not that, none of them are doing that well. And I think a lot of them need to look at themselves as, and it's not to say great, I'm great for trying, I'm all for experimentation, but sometimes I think we pick up a certain way of doing something and then we stick with it and then it doesn't work and we blame the medium. This happens with podcasting a lot. And sometimes I think people too quickly jump to blaming the medium. And I think that's one space for sure that Canada's lacking is we have a lot of news. We have a couple of news podcasts, but they're national, right?
Yeah.
So again, that geography piece and sometimes even those national ones try to play to US audiences too. I think we're not serving Canadian audiences well enough.
When somebody accuses you or your organization of being the mainstream media, what goes through your mind?
Man, that's a loaded question. Right now, it's a really tough time to be a journalist. And we talk about this actually all the time, where it's, coming into media and driving that branded truck to an event and being proud. That's what it used to be, proud, and parking wherever and getting in and having people look and smile and wave. And now we're having conversations about potentially stripping our logos off cars because we don't want to get egged and harassed and followed. And it's sad. What I just keep saying, I really despise people who go the media and they loop us all into one big, like as if we're all meeting underground and passing around memos of what we're going to all say the next day. It's like, it doesn't work that way. And sure, is there areas for improvement? Always. Is there space for growth? And should we be evolving? Yes. Again, always. But when people just say the media, when they loop us all into one, it's like, it just really grinds my gears. I think most people would say that in media, I would imagine, because they know it's not how it goes. It's not how it is.
I was going to point out, it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, my company got accused of being the mainstream media, and it's out of a basement.
Yeah, classic. It's just like...
But aren't we all mainstream media in some capacity? I mean,
it's like, how do you define that? And how do you even define, what do you define as mainstream? And what do you define as media? And what do you define, like, I don't know.
Well, the only difference between the company that you had and the company you work at now is one has some licensed sticks.
Yeah.
Am I wrong? Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it depends whose ears it falls on too, right? It's just also subjective. And I think it now has just become an insult. It's like a go-to scapegoat of an insult. And I also find it interesting that people, even with talk radio, we have a newsroom and we have talk hosts, and how many people don't really even understand the difference between the two. That's something that we continue to try to speak about and say the newsroom is those journalists that are taking, they're trying to fairly recount stories for you and bring you the news. And our hosts have opinions, and that's actually what we're paying for them to have. And that's not the newsroom. It's very different. And even just that distinction, I think I'm shocked by how many listeners and how much feedback we get with people who just don't understand that distinction.
I've taken a poll, and I've actually looked around and witnessed a whole bunch of things, but 100 times out of 100, when somebody is accusing somebody else of being a part of the mainstream media, the person being accused has a slightly larger audience than the person who's making it.
I believe it. It sounds accurate to me.
That's all I know about that.
Oh, man.
Amanda, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been eye-opening, ear-riveting, everything.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. This was really, really great conversation.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Social media by Courtney Krebsbach. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. Imaging courtesy Core Image Studios. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.